Literature and Humanities, Universitas Brawijaya is ready to develop high-quality and international standardized educational process to produce graduates with high global competitiveness. In order to support students' competence and skills, Universitas Brawijaya provides diverse laboratories with sophisticated and modern equipment, including field laboratories, so the intense research culture continues to grow, indicated by innovative inventions that is useful for wide communities.
Mas Windy,
Excellent scientific works and innovations are created.
we can start now, Mas Windy.
Okay, let's prepare myself for a moment.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, everyone, dear all participants, our seminar is about to begin. Please, of course, have a nice seat. Thank you very much for preparing yourself to join in this 3-in-1 program. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam.
Okay, good morning, everyone. Hope everything is going well there. I'm Rizky Bahtiar, the moderator of today's seminar. I'm very pleased to see you here and welcome all of you to this seminar. Today's topic, I think it's very interesting topic, is about research method and ethical conducts in exploring the issues of women, gender, and disability from legal perspective. Let me say, we all are lucky enough to conduct and join this program because it allows us to have wider perspective on gender studies. Dear all participants, our speaker today is Professor Patrick Keyzer. He is a professor of law and public policy and serves as Dean of the Thomas More Law School, Australian Catholic University. I think it's the second day Prof. Patrick Keyzer accompanied us to discuss about gender. Okay, before the presentation begins, let me inform how the presentation will be going on. First, Professor Patrick will be invited to present material. After that, there will be a Q&A session. Please note that you can ask whether speaking in Bahasa Indonesia, and then I will translate it to English, or you are allowed to speak directly in English. Just raise your hand virtually and then just speak up. Another way, you can ask by writing down your question in the chat box. So, in Bahasa Indonesia, Bapak Ibu semua, silahkan nanti ketika selesai materi dipresentasikan, silahkan untuk bertanya. Bisa menggunakan bahasa Indonesia, bisa juga menggunakan bahasa Inggris, atau menggunakan kolom chat box untuk menuliskan pertanyaannya baik dalam bahasa Indonesia maupun dalam bahasa Inggris. Okay, I think it's all. Now allow me to welcome Professor Patrick Keyzer to deliver his presentation. Time is yours, Professor.
Thank you very much, Rizky. I appreciate your warm introduction, and as you mentioned, I'm very happy to take your questions at the end of the presentation. I'd like to also introduce my colleague, Patricia Maloney, who is a member of the International Network of Women with Disabilities, and is also a former Chief Executive Officer of Women with Disabilities Australia. So we're very lucky to have Tricia with us. And in addition, Patricia Maloney has very kindly agreed to participate in the question and answer session at the end of the lecture. I'd also like to thank Nastiti for her work doing the translation for people who are hearing impaired. Now, what I'd like to do now is share my screen. So if you can just wait a minute while I load my presentation, I will do that very soon. Bear with me. Hold on a second. Bear with me. Okay. Can you see the first page of my presentation? Yes?
I think it's not appear yet.
Yeah, let's have a look. Can you see the first page of my presentation yet?
Still haven't.
Okay, let me just try it again. There we go. How about that?
Yes.
Yeah.
Good. Okay, so what I will do is I will have a slide in English, and then I'll follow that with a slide in Bahasa Indonesia. And Pak Rizky, if you want to add anything to my Bahasa translation, I'm very happy for you to add. So this lecture is about research methods and ethics for investigating women, gender and disability. And then you have the Bahasa translation of that. In today's lecture, I'm firstly going to be talking about some of the concepts from yesterday's lecture. And then I'll be talking about contemporary disability research ethics, participatory research methodology, confirmation bias, human rights approaches to disability research, emancipatory disability research, and inclusive disability research. So those are the things I'll be talking about today, and then we'll take questions. So as I said in yesterday's lecture, contemporary disability studies uses an interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary approach. So we are interested in economics, law, public policy, social policy, all of the different ways that as researchers we can examine society. We use all of those methods when we're looking at the phenomenon of people with disability. And we also recognise that contemporary disability studies sits at the intersection of all of these different disciplines. So it's important for us to have an understanding of the different disciplines and to also work in teams and groups of people. So we're not just interested in just doing things with lawyers. As lawyers, we should be interested in social science, economics, public policy, all of the different things that help make up our society. And this is really the contemporary approach to disability studies. It's based on many different disciplines coming together and we bring things together when we're studying disability. We're interested in the intersection of all of those different areas of study. Another thing that I mentioned in yesterday's lecture that I'll just mention again today is the social model of disability. And the social model of disability is based on the view that we should not regard a person with a disability as being medically deficient in any way. What we should do is we should focus on how society provides access and support to people with disabilities so that they can realise their human rights. So the example that I gave yesterday was about a person in a wheelchair. Now, a person in a wheelchair just needs a ramp to enter a building or an elevator or a lift. And what we need to do is when we're building new buildings, we need to avoid using stairs and start thinking about ramps so people in wheelchairs can gain access, because they are entitled to access buildings just as people who can use stairs. So the focus then is on society and how society disables people rather than people having a disability. Another point that I mentioned yesterday that I wanted to reinforce in today's lecture is the idea that there should be nothing about us without us. So James Charlton is a disability researcher who has said that if we are going to conduct disability research and disability research involving women or people of diverse genders, then we need to involve women with disability in that process. And we need to do it very directly. And what I'd like to talk about now are some of the methodological issues and some of the ethical issues surrounding working with women with disability. In yesterday's lecture, I mentioned the ladder of citizen participation. This is this idea that we should aim for control warga. We should aim for citizen control of research, and we should avoid manipulation. So we need to climb up that ladder and we need to be at the top and make sure that any of the research that we are involved in has got citizen involvement. So if we are researching women with disability, then women with disability need to have control of the project. So in control warga, the stakeholders have the idea, they set up the project, they then go to experts for advice and discussion and support, but those people don't direct the research. The research is done by women with disability. And what we need to do as researchers is support women with disability to do research on themselves, as it were. And that really should be our guiding star. That should be our objective when we're developing research projects. Now, there may be times when citizen control is not possible. So, for example, if a woman with a disability has an intellectual disability or a cognitive impairment, then researchers may need to be a little bit more involved in the research to support and assist those people in doing the research, okay? And in those circumstances, Kemitran is an approach that can be taken to this issue. But it's important that such an approach be dealt with very, very carefully, because you want to avoid what researchers call confirmation bias. So whenever you're doing research with people, you have to make sure that you don't just look for the information that you want to see. And anytime you have a partnership in research, there is the risk of confirmation bias. Okay, so let's talk about, we'll come to confirmation bias in a minute, but I just want to talk about some general contextual factors that should frame our research when we're involved in research with women with disability. We need to be, the first thing we need to know is that Indonesia has signed the United Nations Convention on the Rights of People with Disability. And that means that anytime we engage in research with women with disability in Indonesia, we should do that consistently with the United Nations Convention. That's the first point. The second point is we should take into account the social model of disability, because that's consistent with human rights. Thirdly, we need to remember all of those statistics that I was talking about yesterday, that women with disability are less likely to be able to read and write, are more likely to be subjected to violence, and are more likely to be living in poverty. So we need to be aware of all of those things when we're conducting our research. Then we need to engage in inclusive research. So we need to involve women with disabilities in our research. And as much as possible, we need to let women with disabilities, or ensure that, I should say, we need to ensure that women with disabilities are leading the research. So that's the sort of philosophical framework within which our research can and should take place. And these are important philosophical, political, and practical issues. Whenever you are working out how you should go about research with people with disability, you need to be very, very careful. You need to think carefully about the philosophies that sit behind your research. You need to think about the politics, and you need to think about the practical issues when you are engaged in research. So how should a researcher formulate their research questions? How should they gather data? How should they present findings? What conclusions should they be drawing about how people with disability are to be researched? And how will this benefit people with disability? These are all very important questions that you need to think about when you are designing your research project. And I think a critical one there concerns how you present research for people with disability, because it's very important that people with disability receive the information in a format that makes sense for them. So today we have the benefit of Nastiti and Akmarina, who are our interpreters for people with a hearing impairment. We're very lucky to have them helping us with this lecture. But if we did a research project together and we didn't make that information available to people who are hearing impaired or to people who have a visual impairment, then there may have been no purpose in conducting that research at all if we can't share that information with people with disability. So One of the phrases that's often used in disability research is participatory research methodology. That is, working out a research methodology that ensures the participation of people with disability in that research. And participatory methods, participatory research methods are geared towards planning and conducting the research process in a way that is consistent with the lived experiences of, in this case, people with disability. So I'll just leave that slide up there for a minute because I know there's a lot of information in it. Yeah. Okay, so, and in participatory research methodology, the participatory research process enables co-researchers, that is people with disability and people without disability, to step back from their typical routines, their forms of interaction, and the power relationships in order to fundamentally rethink how they go about their business. And it's actually quite a demanding process because people who don't have a disability can never truly and completely understand someone who does. And that's why when people with disability and people without disability are working together, we need to think very carefully about how we ensure participation can take place, and we can ensure participation takes place in a way that is consistent with our research objectives. Okay, now, if we are going to have a participatory research methodology where people with disability participate in the research process, but also researchers without a disability, we have to be careful to avoid confirmation bias. That is, the belief, well, confirmation bias takes place when a researcher looks for things in the data rather than letting the data speak for itself. In other words, if you select the information that you want rather than engaging in a process that merely produces the data. And confirmation bias is very, very common in research, and we have to take steps to avoid it. And I suppose probably a really good example of confirmation bias is this. Now, we know that in 2020, so last year, we know that Joe Biden won the presidency of the United States, okay? And we know that Donald Trump lost the presidency of the United States in 2020. But there are millions of Americans who believe that the election was stolen from Donald Trump and given to Joe Biden, and that it was a set of illegal activities. Now, lawyers went to court, and on 60 occasions, they tried to challenge the election, and all of those election challenges were thrown out. And so the Senate, the United States Senate, certified the election result for Biden. Now, even though there is no evidence of electoral fraud, there are a lot of people in America who believe that Joe Biden should not be the president and that Donald Trump should be the president. And it's the same with vaccines for COVID. You know, there are many people who, rather than listen to the scientists, would prefer to believe their own research, and they do their own research, and that leads them into errors, which they should probably avoid if they spoke to their doctor. So confirmation bias is very, very common in our society. And even though as researchers, we are well-educated people, and we are serious about data and we take things seriously, that doesn't mean that we can't make mistakes when it comes to research. So you have to think about ways you can avoid confirmation bias. It is difficult to avoid. It can be very difficult to avoid, but it can be managed, okay? And the best way to manage confirmation bias is to use proven social science techniques when you are developing your data. So there are a number of Delphi techniques which require you to ask other people what they should be looking for. Nominal group technique, which I've discussed previously in previous times I've visited Brawijaya, and also listening theory. There are people who have done studies about how you listen to people and use information. Okay, once you've worked out your methods and that sort of thing, and you've decided you're using a participatory research methodology, you should also be aware of the need to ensure that your research is consistent with human rights. So research has the potential to be a powerful tool for the realisation of the rights of people with disability. And so there is an organisation called the International Disability Human Rights Research Network, and they have developed a protocol for the conducting of research with people with disability, and there are some details of it there. So if you type in International Disability Human Rights Research Network into Google, you will come across their work and you can see the research protocols that they have developed to guide our research processes. And of course, there are substantial reasons why we should take a human rights approach. Human rights approaches are preferable because they recognise that we are all human, whether we have a disability or not, and they appeal to our common humanity. And they are implicitly supportive of the social model of disability, which of course is a superior approach. I'll just leave that slide on the screen for a moment. And of course, the human rights approach emphasises our common interests and humanity rather than our differences. Another variety of disability research that I thought that I'd mention is emancipatory disability research. And this is the belief that people with disability and their organisations themselves should have control of the research process. So it shouldn't be about universities and professors, it should be about people with disability themselves, and their research should be directed towards their emancipation, their freedom. So you remember that the work of James Charlton, Nothing About Us Without Us, was based on the notion that people with disability are everywhere around the world, they are oppressed. They experience disability oppression. So the antidote to disability oppression is emancipation. And emancipation takes place when it's people with disability who are calling the shots. They're making the decisions. They decide what they want to do. And there is a lot of research and writing about emancipatory disability research. And if you are interested in conducting disability research, it's worth your while to read that literature to familiarise yourself with that philosophy. Another variety of disability research that is evident in the literature is inclusive disability research. So increasingly, academic researchers are becoming involved in inclusive research, in which people with a lived experience of disability are included as part of the research team. I've referred to a chapter by an English scholar named Smith Mary there, and she talks about inclusive disability research in her work, and I've included the reference later in these slides. So inclusive disability research is about bringing people with disability into the research and giving them power to make important decisions about how research is conducted. So that's my presentation, and I'm very happy to take questions. I'll just go back to the beginning, and I'll stop the share. And now I'm ready to take questions, and you're there, Tricia, I can see. Yep. So Tricia and I are ready to take your questions. So I will open the chat.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Patricia.
My pleasure.
And I forget to mention to all sign language interpreters, you all are doing very good job.
Yeah,
thank you very much.
Yeah.
Okay. Again, Professor Patrick Keyzer just giving us such informative and interesting presentation relating to contemporary disability study. And he said that contemporary disability study is multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary approach. So it's kind of a big opportunity for us to doing a joint research and something like that.
Yeah.
So to open up our mind on disability study, might be we have a Q&A section. If you want to ask directly to Professor Keyzer, just raise your hand virtually using Bahasa Indonesia or in English, or maybe you just mention it in the chat box. Is there any question? Let me check. Just raise your hand if you want to ask some question. Maybe to start, I just want to confirm Professor Patrick.
Yep.
So you mentioned about disability research, and I think before that, thinking critically and carefully about what is disability is a crucial part of helping our students, researchers to understand their society, their relationship, their families, their own experiences that we don't experience that, to make the world more accessible and accepting. And then you mentioned about citizens' participation and doing some participatory research. How to develop thinking critical thinking, and how we know what the disability people think about what they feel, their feelings, their experiences, and something like that. Because I think it's very critical.
Yeah, yeah. Look, I think that's a good question. Often, as a researcher, you know, when I engage in research projects, I usually have a lot of ideas about what I think is going on, but I'm really quite anxious to make sure that my own ideas don't infect what it is I'm looking at, which of course is avoiding confirmation bias, right? So what I usually do when I work with people with disability, or indeed when I work with any people, is I ask them to tell me what they think is important. Okay, so I'll give you an illustration. I'll give you an example. A few years ago, I wrote a book which was called A History of Disability Services in New South Wales, which is part of Australia. Yeah. And I knew that if I chose to focus on particular historical events, that would involve confirmation bias, right? So if I only spoke about, this person's speech and this person's important meeting and this policy and that policy, then I would be doing the selecting. And that means you're going to get confirmation bias. So what I did was I got together two groups of people with disability. I had a group of 12 and a group of 8, two separate groups. And I went to them and I said, what do you think I should write about in my book? I want you to give me a list of all of the chapters that you think I should put in my book. In other words, you tell me what the important historical events are. You tell me what the important policies are. You tell me what's important. And then I'll write about what you tell me is important. So I'll show you. I'm going to share my screen again. Just going to, let's see. What I'm going to do is I'm going to bring up the article that I wrote so that you can see it. Hold on a second. I can't find it, but it's in a journal called Law in Context. So if you type my name and also Law in Context into Google, you'll come across an article that I wrote about avoiding bias in research with people with disability. And basically the approach you should take is that instead of making assumptions about things, you should ask people with disability. You should say to them, what do you think I should do? And they will tell you. So I might stop there and give Tricia an opportunity to speak.
Thanks, Patrick. I think for me, it's very important to understand that why you're doing research. What is the purpose of the research? And I think that if you're doing it for your own knowledge, I must admit I sometimes do research for my own knowledge, but what is going to be the impact on people with disabilities? And I think it's also important just to emphasise what Patrick's saying is that people with disabilities do have an understanding of the things that are important to them. And by including us in the conversation, you actually are enriching the research. And just think of it that way. What is the purpose? What will be the outcome of your research for people with disabilities? Will it have a negative impact? Will it have an unintended impact on people with disabilities? So I think for me, it's just understanding why and the results. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. I can't find the article, but I will send it to you when I can find the details. So thank you for your question, Risky. I can see that there are some more questions in the chat box. Are you able to translate any of them for me?
Okay. It's the third question. I think it's almost the same with my question. So
Sorry, you went on to mute there, Risky.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry.
That's all right.
Okay, thank you very much, Patrick, Prof. Patrick, for your explanation. So the third question, I think it's almost the same with my question. So it's from Mahali. She said about the principle of nothing about us without us. I just remembering one subject when we compare two different people to draw a specific, like an animal like elephant. The first person, he did, or he have seen what kind of elephant, and the second one, they have never seen an elephant. So the result is, of course, it would be an abstract drawing. So I think the third question, you have mentioned it and you have explained the answer. So I think it's okay. I think we have to move on to the second question from Zulkifli. How are the
Excuse me, Rizky. I think Mahali asked about if the researchers, I can say that how put the researcher is not a person with disability, but intending to getting involved in research about people with disability. So what his position on it? I think this is about ethic consideration. Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Bu Wika. But some of the point Professor Patrick has mentioned about that. But okay, it might be if we want to develop more from the third question. So the third question is about how should a non-disabled researcher, as you mentioned before, position himself when he conduct specific research on accessibility or something like that relating to person with disability, Professor Patrick?
Yeah, sure. Okay, look, I think there is a view amongst some people that and some people who believe in emancipatory disability research, they think that people who don't have disabilities should not be involved in disability research. All right. So that's a pretty, that's one position to take. Then there are other people who say, well, look, you don't have to have a disability to be able to do disability research, right? In which case, you know, that's another position. And in between the two positions is inclusive disability research, which means that you have people with disability involved on the research team to make sure there is that perspective. And it makes sure that the research team is constantly thinking about the issues that face the people with disability. And you can also then make sure that within your research design, you take steps to include people with disability and their perspectives. So let me give this example for Mahali. Right now, we have the benefit of having Akmarina and Nastiti, who are giving us their translations for people who are hearing impaired. If I wanted to conduct disability research at Universitas Brawijaya with people who have a hearing impairment, I would have to have Akmarina and Nastiti involved in conducting those, in ensuring that there's effective translation for people who are hearing impaired. I might also want to make sure that there's material available in writing so that the people with hearing impairment who can read that material could read it and think about it beforehand. I might also want to make sure that there is a recording of the participant information statement and the research ethics protocols and lots of information, so that a person with a visual impairment could listen to a recording of all of that information, so that they have access to that information. So there are different researchers who have different views about these things, and not any particular view is always right or always wrong. It really is a matter of your philosophy, but the impact of your research is considerably more likely to assist people if you have thought about all of the different ways your research project can be communicated, and you have involved people with disability in the research design and methodology so that they can advise you about what you need to do. So I'll just stop there and invite Patricia to add to my answer.
Thank you. And I agree with everything you've just said, of course. What I wanted to add is just an explanation for me. When I am talking about my deaf colleagues, so I can't walk, that's my disability. When I'm talking about my deaf colleagues, I don't do it without conversations with my deaf colleagues. I don't tell other people what deaf people need. I know the social barriers that society puts on my deaf colleagues, which is about not having sign language interpreters, not having the appropriate supports in place, and the same with my vision impaired friends. I don't talk on their behalf. I include them in the conversation. The same for my colleagues who have intellectual disabilities. I don't speak on their behalf. I include them in the conversation. There are, as Patrick has said, some very, very extreme views. So for me, I'm more middle of the road. I consider anybody who wants to work in this space as an ally to people with disabilities. So if we have come together as partners, as true partners, we will have much better outcomes for all of us, for society. So thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Patrick and Patricia. So maybe I have some explanations in bahasa Indonesia.
Yes, please.
For Mahali. Jadi pada intinya, secara umum, bagaimana seorang peneliti yang bukan penyandang disabilitas harus memposisikan diri ketika melakukan penelitian tentang disabilitas itu sendiri. Tentunya yang paling utama yang disampaikan oleh Profesor Patrick dan Patricia adalah pelibatan dari teman-teman disabilitas itu sendiri. Yang paling dibutuhkan salah satunya adalah advice. Jadi apa sudut pandang dia berkaitan dengan apa yang sedang saya tulis, atau apa yang sedang saya kerjakan terkait dengan riset. Itu yang pertama. Tapi yang kedua, ada juga beberapa tantangan ketika kita melakukan riset tentang disabilitas, di mana kita adalah bukan seorang penyandang disabilitas, terutama adalah berkaitan dengan view. Tadi Patricia menyampaikan ada semacam extreme view di mana ketika saya sebagai seorang peneliti dan juga seorang penyandang disabilitas mempunyai view yang berbeda. Bahkan saya mempunyai view yang kadang itu tidak sesuai dengan apa yang diinginkan atau apa yang dirasakan oleh penyandang disabilitas. Nah, salah satu solusinya adalah bagaimana kemudian seorang peneliti itu menjadi seorang ally atau partner atau teman ketika dia ingin meriset mengenai spesifik kondisi disabilitas atau spesifik tema tentang disabilitas. Jadi dia bukan sebagai orang mempunyai view yang berbeda atau sudut pandang yang berbeda atau mempunyai konklusi yang berbeda, tapi dia sebagai partner. Sebenarnya apa yang kamu rasakan, apa yang kamu alami, dan bagaimana sudut pandang kamu terkait dengan dunia ini. Jadi in a specific way, di konteks disabilitasnya. Ada tambahan, Bu Wike?
Iya, Rizky, saya mau memperkenalkan profesor yang hadir, profesor dari PMKW yang hadir ya.
Ya.
Yeah, okay. So, Professor Patrick and Patricia, now maybe I will take 30 seconds only, but I recognize the attendance of our professor in Women and Gender Studies, Profesor Kepi Sukesi. Tolong di head Profesor Kepi Sukesi, Profesor Mufida, and then Profesor Harsuko Riniwati. So welcome to join us, Professor, Ibu Kepi, Ibu Mufida, and Ibu Harsuko Riniwati. This is the second day, professors. So thank you for your coming.
Yeah, it's really great to have you. It's nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too.
Okay, thank you.
Late because my network, my internet is off.
Yeah. I think in 2 days we have problems with internet connection. Yeah, there are two big companies to support the networking is I think that is still going and with trouble. So I'm sorry about that. Yeah.
If it's any consolation, we have exactly the same problems here in Australia.
Yeah.
We often have internet problems, so I think we're all doing quite well. But it's very nice to meet you, Professor, and I look forward to seeing all of you in Malang at some point in the future after we get through COVID.
Yes. Thank you so much. So I will continue with the question.
Okay, thank you very much, Ibu Wike.
Yeah.
Again, we are pleased to be accompanied by some professors here, Professor Kepi Sukesi and Professor, let me check.
Mufida.
Okay.
Yeah.
Some of those are my lecture when I was an undergraduate student.
Bachelor, yes, bachelor degree.
Yeah. Okay. Maybe we have to move to the next question. It's from Zulkifli. I think again, Professor Patrick has mentioned about that. It's about how are the results of research on people with disability effective in changing the mindset of people in Australia. I think it's an interesting question. Just go on with Professor Patrick. Sorry, it's
Tricia, did you want to go first with that one?
I can do that. Certainly, I think it's a slow process. I think we're starting to see the change coming in. But to be quite honest with you, research doesn't usually get broadly published unless there's something spectacular in it. So most of us understand the need for change and the need for change in attitudes. But I think it's people with disabilities, our families, our allies, and those who are working to change the lives of people with disabilities who hold the key. So our politicians have recognised the need for change and inclusion by instituting the National Disability Insurance Scheme, as Patrick spoke of yesterday. but it's very difficult to get them to think beyond the economics and to not understand that actually having a scheme like this will increase the economic benefits for the whole of Australia. So I think it's really important that we do get research done, that we are able to apply the research in a practical way. The first thing we need to do, though, is collect data. Without data, it's very hard to have real research. A lot of the work that I do in gender and disability is really anecdotal evidence. So around violence against women with disabilities, because very few people actually collect the data. So it's really about who I can speak to. And unless we have data, it's hard to do practical research. And without practical research that you can actually present to people and say, this is real evidence that people with disabilities are disadvantaged, particularly women with disabilities, then it's going to be very difficult to change. But we are making small steps, and we won't change unless we make those small steps first. Thank you. I'll hand back to you, Patrick.
Yeah, look, I don't really have that much to add, except to say that because of the National Disability Insurance Scheme, there is a lot more research about the impact of that scheme on people, and that set of policies and the law. It's not perfect. It still needs plenty of reform, but you know, for many people, it was a significant step forward in terms of getting supports for their livelihood, for their lives. Yeah, but there's always plenty of research going on in Australia concerning people with disability, and trying to advance further reforms in that area.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Patrick and Patricia. Could you explain more, maybe Patricia or Professor Patrick, about National Disability Insurance? I'm interested with that.
Tricia, did you want to go first?
Sure, I can start on that. So, and I am a member of the National Disability Insurance Scheme Independent Advisory Council. So that's a group of people with disabilities from around Australia with a variety of disabilities, and a couple of family members and a couple of researchers who are appointed by the Minister to advise on the steps forward. So it was set up in 2013, and the idea of it is, and it's covered by legislation, is to provide the people with the supports they need to be able to participate in society. So for me, for example, because I can't walk, I use calipers and crutches, they will fund that for me. Prior to that, I paid for that myself, and it's quite a substantial amount of money. And while I work and can afford it, there are many people who cannot afford it. And I know that this is common around the world. So if you need a wheelchair, for example, they will pay for that. And the idea is that it actually enables us to get to work and to be able to contribute as taxpayers. The other part of it is that it provides supports for people to enable families to be able to go back to work. So if you have, you are supporting an adult with a disability, so you need to be with them to be able to get them out of bed, to get them dressed, to feed them, to make sure they're safe all day, then it's very hard for you to continue to work. And what this has meant is that many people are able to go back to work. And I'll give you an example. So I have a friend who is a doctor. She has a son who has a severe disability who requires support all the time. Because of the NDIS, she is now able to return to work because her son has the supports he needs to be able to live without her with him 24 hours a day. So there's two parts to that. He gets to spend time not just with mum, he gets to spend time with people his own age, because there's somebody to take him to places where he can meet other young people. And Mum has been able to return to work as a doctor. So there's an economic benefit to Australia, and there's a benefit to her as a doctor being able to return to her chosen profession. So it really is about giving us the support we need. It's not about health, that's separate. So we have universal health care in Australia, so that's covered separately. We have an insurance scheme that covers that. And if you get a disability later in life, it covers you then. So it's not just for people who have always had disabilities, it's for those who get a disability, which is why it's called an insurance scheme. So everybody in Australia is covered by that, unless you're over 65. If you're over 65, then that's covered by the aged care sector. If you get a disability after 65. So I've had a disability since I was 4 months old when I contracted polio. I'm now over 65, but because I got into the NDIS before I turned 65, I'm still able to be part of that program. I hope that's a good explanation. I hope that was understood. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Patricia, for your explanation and your experience. Okay, I'm interested with that. Okay, is there any explanation from Professor Patrick?
Yeah, look, I guess the only thing I'd add to that is it is an insurance scheme. So the idea is that a person with a disability makes effectively a claim or an application for what are called reasonable and necessary supports. So under the United Nations Convention on the Rights of People with Disability, there is a recognition in that international convention that people with disability should be supported so that they can participate fully in social life, so that their disability does not prevent them from participating as fully as they possibly can in social and public life. So if you have a disability, you make an application to the National Disability Insurance Scheme. There is a process, a bureaucratic process of them making an assessment of your application. And sometimes your application might include evidence that's supplied by experts. So, for example, my nephew who has cerebral palsy, we got advice. We got an expert's report from an occupational therapist. We also got an expert report from a psychologist. And we took those and we got an expert report from a doctor. And we took those 3 reports and we added them to the application that he made for a package of funding and supports. And then the government responded and they said, no, too much money. You've asked for too much money. So we appealed that to the Administrative Appeals Tribunal. So we went to a court and I represented my nephew and I said, look, you got to cough up. We need more money because he needs more support so that he can, get a job and pay taxes and do all the things that everybody else takes for granted. Yeah. And so the government said, okay, fine, we will give you what you want. And we had a negotiation and then we worked out a package. And now every 2 years, they come back to him and they say, are you happy with your package or do you want it changed in any way? And there's a process. And whenever he sends an email to the NDIS, he copies me in so that they know that there's a lawyer there. If I'm not happy, I can wave around the legislation and make sure that we get a good result.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Patrick and Patricia. Jadi dalam bahasa Indonesia untuk pertanyaan dari Zulkifli, jadi salah satu efek dari riset terhadap disabilitas adalah munculnya salah satunya adalah National Disability Insurance. Jadi semacam asuransi untuk penyandang disabilitas yang sebenarnya kalau kita komparasikan dengan di Indonesia identically atau identik dengan asuransi di bidang kesehatan. Tapi tadi Profesor Patrick dan Patricia menyampaikan bahwa asuransi ini tidak hanya berkaitan dengan masalah atau isu-isu kesehatan saja, tapi untuk memastikan dana yang berhasil dihimpun dan dikeluarkan atau yang di-manage oleh asuransi tersebut digunakan untuk masyarakat penyandang disabilitas untuk berpartisipasi di kegiatan sosial. Dan tentunya yang terakhir, yang kurang lebih sama juga disampaikan oleh Profesor Patrick dan Patricia adalah memastikan bahwa penyandang disabilitas bisa mendapatkan pekerjaan yang layak, yang kurang lebih sama dengan masyarakat pada umumnya. Okay, thank you very much for your explanations, Professor Patrick and Patricia. We have to move on to the next question. So let me check in the chat box. We have Rahma. She has two questions. And the first question, the weakness of many programs in the community, including the disability program, is in the monitoring and evaluation section. Okay, so if we look at the policy cycle in general, we have formulation, implementation, and evaluation. The problem in Indonesia, in some cases, and relating to disability program, is that we just focus on formulation. After that, in the implementation and evaluation sections, we just forget about that to include disabilities person or to include many actors that should be included in this part. So what do you think about that, Professor Patrick and Patricia?
So I've included the first part of an answer in the chat, and basically what if you design a research program well, right, you include people with disability in the research design. So let's just say that everybody involved on this Zoom call was working with me and Patricia on a research project about people with a hearing impairment in Malang. Okay, let's say we're all working on that project together. What we would do is we would make sure that there are people on our research team who have a hearing impairment, okay, and who live in Malang. Okay, so they can tell us, they can advise us about the research. Then what we would do is we would design a research project where we would ask people with a hearing impairment in Malang, what do you think are the issues? So they tell us, so we avoid confirmation bias, yeah? They tell us what the issues are. And then when we get that data, we would then go back to our research group that includes our people with a hearing impairment who live in Malang, and we would say to them, okay, this is what the data is telling us. Now, tell us what we should do with that data to share it with people with a hearing impairment in Malang to develop solutions. And then they would say, okay, this is what you need to do. You need to have an expert reference group of people in Malang with a hearing impairment, and they can tell you what to do with the data, but also what you should take from that data. So the point is you involve people with a hearing impairment in Malang at every stage of the research journey. That way, that you're engaging in inclusive, participatory research. And if you may have an emancipatory agenda, but you are accepting that someone like me who doesn't live in Malang and doesn't have a hearing impairment can still conduct valid research with this group, but you do everything you can in the design of your project to have good data collection, well-informed, and monitoring and evaluation at the end of the project by people who have a lived experience of disability, people with a hearing impairment in Malang. So I'll stop there and I'll ask Tricia to add to my answer.
And I'm not going to add very much except about the evaluation part of it. So there has been research in the past which has been designed by people without disabilities to be about people with disabilities. And they have not only asked the questions, but they've evaluated their answers without asking anybody with a disability. And of course, then we've all said, well, actually, that's completely wrong. So I think that, you know, we need to be involved at every stage. And I think it's important to understand too that we are the experts in the field. And the second part of that question was about involving significant others, such as families. And for me, I always involve families in the conversations. And to explain that a little bit, in the past, there were three groups who thought that they owned disability. So it was people with disabilities, families of people with disabilities, and the disability service sector. And we didn't talk to each other. So if we talk to each other and we combine our expertise, we come out with much more valuable research and better outcomes for everybody. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Patrick and Patricia. So disabilities, we have to see them not only as an object, but also as an expert, as mentioned by Professor Patrick. So to involve them in every step. Again, you have to involve them in every step, only just in the beginning to confirm some data and something like that, but also in the middle and also in the final recommendation, for example, as mentioned by Professor Patrick, as an expert. So is it relevant or not? Something like that. So it will minimize what Professor Patrick mentioned in the PowerPoint about the bias. And the second question, I think Professor Patrick has answered, has responded what Rahma's asking. Are there any limitation to involving and using the opinions of significant others, in this case, the families of persons with disabilities, in our research? Because who really might be our family, they know more about daily life of disabilities than us as researchers. And Professor Patrick has answered the second question, but I think Professor Patrick needs to explain more about that.
Sure. So look, it is true that the family members of people with disability often have a really good understanding of a person with a disability. That makes sense. They have the they are closest in terms of the lived experience of that person. You just need to be really careful in that context, because there is a risk that you are replacing your own confirmation bias with the confirmation bias of another person. So for example, in yesterday's lecture, Tricia was talking about how, 50 years ago in Australia, people with disability were shut up at home by their parents and were not allowed to go out, or they very rarely went out, and they may not have gone to school. And so they didn't necessarily learn the skills and develop the experiences that would allow them to survive in the community once their parents had died, right? And if there's a lot of research on this. If you went to a person's home and their parents didn't want you to be involved in supporting those people with disability, they'd say, go away, we know what we're doing. No one knows our child better than us. And I have children and I understand that. If somebody came to my house and said, I can understand your children better than you can, I'd say, what are you talking about? I've been living with them for, 16, 17, 18 years. Of course I know them better than you do. But the fact of the matter is, sometimes parents and their urge to protect their child from whatever they think is the issue can create problems, because it means that person with a disability is not getting the sort of support that they might need. So what you need to do is, by all means, involve families. It's important, but just be very careful about how you do it. Don't let families control your research, because ultimately you're the researcher and you have to take the steps to avoid the confirmation bias. And that means you need to think about the design of your research very carefully and then make those appropriate decisions. Dr. Wike has asked about getting consent, and of course you have to get consent. It's difficult sometimes when you're conducting research with people with intellectual disability to ensure that you have that consent. It's very, very difficult indeed, but you should do everything you can to get consent. So I'll stop there, and Tricia, if you wanted to add anything.
Yes, and I suppose I wanted to talk about the gender part of it. So for women with disabilities, I often am brought in to be the interviewer for women with disabilities because they feel more comfortable with me. And especially because I work in the family violence sector as well, that I always make sure that I've got the supports they need, because sometimes there's some issues that are brought up that really can affect women with disabilities. When I interview women with intellectual disabilities, they're sometimes smarter than me. They really do know what's going on around them if we explain things in the right way. I would always recommend that when you are doing research with women with disabilities, that one of the lead researchers be a woman. And if possible, a woman with a disability. Because women with disabilities say to me, you make us feel comfortable and you make us feel like there's nothing we can't say to you because you understand where we're coming from. And it's interesting that you mentioned pain, because it's not the physical pain so much as the emotional pain. And sometimes that pain comes from being kept safe all your life, being kept out of society. And I know that there are many mothers in Australia who don't want to let their daughters be independent because they're scared of what will happen to them. And my advice is always, in that case, prepare your daughters early, the same as you prepare your other daughters to actually be in society. So certainly get consent for sure. And look, you're all smart people in this room. You understand what I mean when I say it's good if you can have a woman with a disability to do the interviewing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor.
Patricia. Sorry.
Yeah.
Can I ask more
yeah.
to Patricia?
It's okay.
Patricia, I'm just wondering about how you can building the trust between you and the woman you interview without creating something harmful, we can say like that, like a tearing drop or the body language telling you that you have to stop interview me. How you can
Yes.
thank you.
I always say that consent can be withdrawn at any time, right? The woman has the right to say no whenever she needs to. But I have conducted many interviews with a woman crying the whole time. And it's about saying, it's okay to cry. It's okay to be emotional. And also say, okay, let's stop now. Let's have a cup of tea. Let's relax a bit. So sometimes it is very difficult, but I think that, you know, we just have to use our own sensitivity and perhaps understand where that pain's coming from. There's been a couple of films that have come out lately. One's called Crip Camp, which is about the experience of people with disabilities in America. It might be worth looking at that. And it's really about, I can't watch it because it's actually, I get a little bit of post-traumatic stress disorder because it's so stressful on me to see what's happened to other people with disabilities that needn't have. So some people have actually gone through that experience of being mistreated, even with the best of intentions, but have been excluded from life, and they've had to fight to get ahead now. So one of my friends is a deaf woman, and she grew up in poverty, right? And wasn't mistreated by her family, but was mistreated by others around her. And she's doing really well now, but she had to go through a process of going through that bad treatment by others, perhaps at school or in the workplace, to get where she's now quite successful. So it is about understanding where people have come from, and then just even just saying, I'm so sorry this has happened to you, can actually start to build that connection. I hope that's useful.
Oh my God. Thank you, Patricia. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Patricia, and your question, Dr. Wike, especially for your empirical evidence, Patricia. It's so touching. And then thank you very much, Professor Patrick. I just want to quote your statement, don't make your family control your research. In another meaning, I would say, don't make your scholarship control your research also. Okay, we have to move on to the next question. I think Professor Patrick has answered about that. How about the concern for children with disability? Do the consent come from their legal guardian, maybe their parents? And Professor Patrick said yes, but maybe we have some discussion about that. Just go on,
Yes,
Professor
please.
Patrick.
Yes, please, Professor.
Yeah, sure. So look, certainly in Australia, there's a document called the National Health and Medical Research Council Protocol for the conducting of research. And whenever you do social science research with people in Australia, your research has to abide by that protocol. So that means whenever I do any research at my university and I want to talk to people, I have to fill in an application. It goes to an ethics committee. They review it. They consider whether it complies with the National Health and Medical Research Council protocol. And if it matches, then I get approval. And then part of that approval is that I have to follow a particular process when I'm conducting the research. So typically, that means you would give the participants in the research what's called a participant information statement. And that sets out what it is you're trying to do in the research and what it is you're trying to find out. And then you have a consent form. And to sign that consent form, you need to be 18 years or older. And you need to understand what's being said to you. And then you can give consent. Now, obviously, when you're doing research with people with disability, if a person has a cognitive impairment or a significant intellectual disability, they may not understand what it is you're trying to do, in which case they can't give consent. Now, obviously, that creates challenges for the researcher, but they're challenges we have to accept because we can't be doing research on people who don't want to be involved. So at some point you have to ask them. So with children, of course, in Australia, you have to get the consent of the parents. That's up to the age of 18. And that means it's the sort of research you can do with children is limited. About a year ago, 2 years ago, I wrote a paper about using social media to recruit research participants. Okay, so increasingly what people are doing is they're going to Facebook to find people to do research with. And you only need to be 13 years old to get a Facebook profile. And you can easily have a fake profile. So there are lots of risks associated with using Facebook for the recruiting of research participants. On the other hand, most people are more likely to have the same Facebook profile than they are to live in the same house for many years, okay? So you can do longitudinal research with people by reference to their information on Facebook in a way that you can't if you're just using their address, okay? So, but all of these raise important and difficult ethical issues that you need to make sure are properly managed in your application. I'll stop there, and if Tricia wants to add anything, then you're welcome to.
Just very briefly, so we talk about informed consent often in the disability sector, which is really just making sure that somebody does understand. So certainly for children, we understand that, but when, as Patrick has said, when we talk about people with intellectual disabilities, we just need to make sure that they do have the capacity to understand. And there is the protocols around how you test to make sure that is the case. So we can't assume that they don't. In fact, the assumption is that they do. So you do have to really be quite strict in how you examine that. Most people with an intellectual disability or who are participating in research can, with support, be able to understand. And it's important that the information that's given to them is given in a format that can be understood. So certainly in Australia, we often use pictograms. So rather than lots of words, we do pictures of what's being asked of them, and then with a small number of words, but with a face-to-face explanation. So one-on-one, let's talk to the person to make sure they do understand. But certainly families and guardians, if necessary, other people who can give consent. But again, as Patrick has said earlier, be careful which parent you choose too. So there are some really fantastic parents out there who really want the best outcomes for their person with a disability that they support. And there are others who are too scared to let go. You know, they worry too much about, well, what's going to happen to them. So just be a bit selective. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Patrick and Patricia. I think we have the last question, because after this we have a concluding remarks from the organizer, the director of interdisciplinary studies, and so on. So we have to move on to the last question from Mr. Zulkifli. I think it's interesting question. How is the cooperation between Australia and Indonesia in conducting research on persons with disabilities?
So there are a number of researchers in Australia who are involved in research projects with Indonesian scholars on disability. Probably the main one is Associate Professor Karen Soldatic, who is, I've just put her name in the chat. So she's at Western Sydney University, and she is doing some work with Pak Slamet in PLSD. So she's someone who's doing some research. Also, Dina Afrianti from the Australian Indonesia Disability Research and Advocacy Network is doing research in this area. And Tricia and I have both worked with Dina before, of course. So there are small amounts of research going on, but I feel confident that after COVID is behind us, that those research opportunities will start to open up again.
Any adding information from Patricia?
No, I couldn't add anything more to that, except that I welcome coming back to Indonesia, even just to share a meal with people and enjoy the food.
Okay, thank you, Professor Patrick and Patricia. I think I have to thank the speaker for the informative and interesting presentation today, and of course yesterday's meeting, and all the participants for this very active participation. I have to say thank you also to the interpreter who has done such a great job today, and finally give the applause for the speaker virtually and for you all. Okay, I think we can call it a day, and we have some concluding remarks from our leader in the university. Maybe I have to give this agenda back to the master ceremony.
Thank you, Mr. Rizky Bahtiar. Ladies and gentlemen, before we close this class, I would like to take a moment for us to take a screenshot for the documentation. Therefore, please make sure your camera is on. For the committee, please help for the screen capture, and in several sessions, I think it's 3 sessions. To all participants, please make sure that your Zoom on cam. Okay, I will count to 3 for the session 1. 1, 2, 3. Okay, the second one. 1, 2, 3. Okay, the last. 1, 2, 3. Okay, thank you. We finished our class today for the second session, and for the closing remarks, I welcome the Director of Postgraduate Universitas Brawijaya, Professor Dr. Marjono Empil, to close the guest lecture and present the certificate of appreciation as visiting professor for Professor Patrick Keyzer. Prof. Marjono, time is yours.
I think Prof. Marjono,
Oh, haven't
yet joined with this.
So how about the closing remarks? Dr. Vika. Should
Okay,
you?
I will do. I will do. So thank you, Prof. Patrick and Patricia for a 2 days activity yesterday and now, and this morning and afternoon on Australia. So I think, but before that, we can give you some certificate paper. Yeah, Mbak Jehan.
Yeah.
Yes, yes, please. So could you please display so Professor Patrick can see? We send you this to your email, Professor. I will.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Terima
Thank
kasih
you.
banyak Bapak Patrick Keyzer and Ibu Patricia for two days activity in lecturing with Izu about women, gender, and disability from a legal perspective, and we will looking forward maybe next year or few years to come will going to see us in Malang in our unit PSLD and our postgraduate school in Brawijaya University. We hope and we're so delighted to have you to discuss with us. So thank you so much. Thank you so much. So I close this guest lecture with Professor Patrick Keyzer and Patricia, and Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alamin. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh, and bye-bye. Bye-bye. Good afternoon to
Thank you very
Patricia and
much.
Patrick. See you
Okay.
next week.
Thank
I hope we can
All right,
see you
all the
next
best.
week.
Yeah, one day. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Vicky.
Bye-bye.
And
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Nastiti and Akmarina and Rizky. Thank you.
Thank you very
Thank
much.
you.
Okay.
Maybe in the future you have to come to Malang, Professor.
Yeah, I would
Yes.
love to. As
Okay.
soon as possible.
Sure.
See you.
Okay.
Bye.
See you.
Bye-bye. Thank you Mbak Nastiti. Thank you Mbak. Siapa tadi satunya lagi? Thank you Mbak Jehan. Thank you Mas Rizky.
Ya.
Dan thank you
Sama-sama,
Bapak
Ibu.
Ibu. Nggih, Bapak Ibu, audiens, Profesor. Ini Pak Agus, Li Tanta. Terima kasih sudah hadir, setia selalu mendampingi kami.
Patrick and Patricia, thank you. Thank you, Bu Wike. Sorry, I'm on the way.
Nggih,
Success
Prof
for
John,
you.
sudah ditutup
All
beliau
right.
tadi. Ya, matur nuwun.
Yeah. Sorry, it's fine. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, say thank you to everybody. Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Oke, Mas Rizky matur nuwun ya. Sudah
Sami-sami, Bu.
dibantu.
Nggih.
Nggih, alhamdulillah. You can leave. Thank you. Nastiti, jangan
Terima
lupa
kasih.
ya. Habisin saya kontak kamu.
Iya, terima kasih Bu.
Iya, matur nuwun sangat.